So when the flat turf season ends in the UK and the jump season starts to creep into the card, we have the spring racing starting on the other side of the world. The Australian racing really lights up dramatically, and we get lots of opportunities to trade some really high quality racing right on the other side of the globe. But what's important in Australian racing? What should you be looking out for? What sort of courses should you be trading? And how does it trade in comparison to the UK? Let's explore that in this video. So I started trading Australian racing fairly early on in my career. I made the decision to start actively trading it because of one particular thing. Can you guess what that was? Because it's something that has made me return to Australian racing every year, and especially the first week in November. So yeah, Australian racing is something that I have traded for a reasonable period of time. So excuse the poor light quality, but you can see it's dark outside, and that is because it's about 3:30 in the morning and I'm just in the final run-in on the Melbourne Cup. I will get up in the middle of the night to trade a horse race, but especially something like the Melbourne Cup. So my introduction to Australian racing was primarily because of the Melbourne Cup. I could tell it was a huge race, that there was an awful lot of money that was going to be traded on it, and therefore I felt the need to get actively involved. And it's a race that over many years has always traded significant amounts of money. And it's something that gets the attention of everybody right around the globe and even in the UK.
Well, there's been a lot of money matched on the exchanges over here in the UK, where, what are we now on the win market? We're 1.7 million quid. So there's plenty of people staying up in the wee small hours of the morning to invest, and we'll be bringing you the race live and all the build-up after this.
So it was the Melbourne Cup that got me started on Australian racing, but over time I expanded outwards from there. And in fact, the story behind how I expanded to much more Australian racing is a bit weird, because I was at the gym one day, I had the kids, took them to the swimming pool, and when I was coming out of the sauna, I slipped and I injured my wrist. And I injured my wrist so badly that it all started to swell up, and we were getting quite concerned about it and stuff like that. But the consequence was that I couldn't really sleep very well that night because it was just in a right old state. And I hurt my back as well. It was just, it was one of those stupid things that occurs that you don't realise. But also it actually led me to trading more Australian racing because I was struggling to sleep. And I sat down at my desk at sort of 3 or 4 in the morning, and I started trading some of the more conventional Australian racing rather than just the Melbourne Cup. And ever since that day, that has been a staple diet of my trading throughout the year, but more particularly at certain times of the year. So let's examine why I sort of trade more particularly and put more focus into certain times of the year and also certain types of courses. So if you're looking to get involved in Australian racing, you will find that there are good times of the year to do it and not. And when we're in the summer in the UK and there's lots of action in UK racing, it tends to be pretty quiet in Australia because obviously it's their winter. But as we move through September and into October, you start to see lots of group racing coming up on the Australian racing cards. And that's when things begin to get really exciting. And all of that builds and builds and builds until we get to the Melbourne Cup. And then immediately we sort of go into a lull straight after. Well, I say straight after. There is still stuff going on, but it's just not the same level of quality and level of interest. So it sort of dies away as we go through to December. However, it comes roaring back on the scene in February and continues on until about sort of April time. So you can tell that the spring and autumn racing is where you're going to find all of the big opportunities in Australian racing. And it's a bit quieter at other times of the year. And that actually fits in quite well with the UK. It's a nice supplement to anything that you're doing on the other side of the world. So it's important to understand that there are a lot of racecourses in Australia. And sometimes I've seen people say, oh, there's no liquidity there. But it's because you're probably looking at the wrong types of racecourses, because you also have different codes in there as well. You get harness racing, and you'll often see on the card a mixture of thoroughbred and harness and all sorts of things. But also you have major metropolitan racecourses, which is where most of the big action takes place, and country courses. And you've also got a massive geographic spread in Australia as well. So when you look at stuff on the East Coast, when we're sort of looking at Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, any group racing that's taking place in any of those territories is going to generate a lot of liquidity and turnover. But as we move across towards the West Coast, things begin to sort of quieten down. So if you get a decent Group 1 at a metro course on the East Coast, that's going to be a good market to trade. But if you get a Group 1 on the West Coast, say at an Ascot, that's not going to be quite as interesting as some of the other courses that you're likely to encounter. And when we're talking about South Australia or Northern Territories again, that isn't quite up there in terms of what you would expect to see in a major city like Melbourne or Sydney. So yeah, there's quite a big difference in terms of the way that you would expect these races to play out. So you're always going to focus in on some of the bigger courses. You're going to focus in on those big metro courses in Sydney or in Victoria, such as Melbourne. So in Melbourne, you'd have Flemington, Caulfield, to name a couple. And your attention should always be around those courses because that's where most of the liquidity will be generated. So for example, just north of Sydney, you have Newcastle. And if they run a race there, that's never going to generate as much as something right in the centre of Sydney. It's just the way that it works over there. And, you know, there are opportunities in each of these, but you're mainly focused on those big metropolitan race courses. And it's worth looking at and trying to identify what those are. So I use a website. I actually know it off the top of my head, but if you want to know what it is, there's a website that I suggest that you use. So let's have a quick look at that particular website. So there are obviously many sites that you could visit in Australia, but one of the sites that I use frequently is RaceNet, and it's simply just a personal preference. Obviously you can choose whichever site you like, but I find RaceNet gives me the information I need very quickly right in front of me. So you can see here we're looking at the Aussie Racing for the 12th of October, and you can see that the main courses, which will be Ascot in Western Australia, Caulfield in Victoria, Eagle Farm in Queensland, South Australia Murray Bridge, and New South Wales Rose Hill. These are all listed at the top here. So these are the big courses that are being raced tomorrow. If we have a look over here, you can see at 5:50 in the morning, we've got a Group 1 weight for age. And you can see there's another Group 1 that follows that, which is the Caulfield Guineas, which will be my focus race tomorrow. But you can see all of the other courses that are running further down here as well. And I just find the format and the way it's laid out really nice. And also, if we go down to here, Group 1 and feature races, then you can see that that's a nice, easy way for us to have a look at all of the big races that are coming up. So you can see coming up next weekend, we've got the Everest, which is 20 million in prize money, which is absolutely massive. However, it is in New South Wales, but we do have the Caulfield Cup coming up next weekend as well, and of course the races that are taking place tomorrow. So yeah, I just find the format of this nice and easy to understand, and it has all the key information right in front of you. So another thing you should take into account is that there are different commission charges and rates across different territories. It gets very complicated at certain moments in time. But the key thing that you really need to understand is that if you try and trade on a racecourse in New South Wales, which would include racecourses in Sydney, then the racing authority there has a turnover charge on the amount that you actually bet, which of course is an extremely negative situation if you're attempting to trade. So as a consequence, when you look at any course that's in New South Wales, including the big metropolitan courses, even if they have a large Group 1, so for example, we have the Everest that has a 20 million prize pot, you'll often find that that will not match anywhere near the same as a massive race such as the Melbourne Cup at Flemington, which is in the state of Victoria. So it's important to differentiate and understand that there are differences in individual regions. But also, if you're actively trading, you probably want to avoid New South Wales. And you can see that other people are avoiding New South Wales because of the turnover charge, because the volumes are significantly lower. But it has a significant impact on exactly what you should do. There isn't a turnover charge anywhere else in any of the other states within Australia. So you still have plenty of opportunity elsewhere, but you need to be consciously aware that New South Wales is a bit of a no-no from a trading perspective. So Australian racing trades in a similar way to the UK racing. Certainly strategies that I've shown you on UK races will work just as well in Australia. But there are some subtle differences. The races go off bang on time in Australia, so you cannot overplay your hand in terms of getting out of the market, because it's very likely that you will get caught out. When you look at UK racing, they tend to go off on average about a minute and a half past post time. And that's actually quite rare in Australia. They get them off very, very quickly, and they have outriders to catch loose racehorses and stuff like that. So everything tends to be much more prompt. They tend to rattle through those races in quick succession. Now, it doesn't mean that you could get a problem, because these things do occur from now and again. But generally speaking, the races will get off much more promptly than the UK. So don't get caught out by that. In terms of the way that money arrives in the market, it's very similar to what you see in the UK. You get large amounts of volume very close to the off. And in fact, I think that's amplified a little bit in Australia because of the scheduling of the races. But it does tend to flow in a similar pattern. The market gets more tighter, competitive, and more liquid as we get closer to the off. And it tends to have a slightly steadier flow than you would expect to see in the UK. They can be pretty tradable. And as long as you stick to those large metro courses, then the markets will produce larger turnover, and that larger turnover will make it act like something you expect to see in the UK. So yeah, there's certainly transplantable skills. If you've learnt to trade in the UK or have a strategy that you have in the UK, it's very likely that you will be able to make it work in Australia. So it's important to understand that when you look over the course of the week, it's not quite the same as you would expect to get in the UK, because there's racing going on, but it's just not of the same standard and doesn't generate as much interest. You tend to get a peak on a Wednesday, and then you get all of the focus in on a Saturday. That's where you get all of the big markets and generally all of the big group racing. There's some Friday evening racing that takes place as well, which you can pick up on Friday morning in the UK. But that sort of comes and goes over the course of the year and is of variable quality. You'll need to qualify what those races are. But when you look at the Saturday, that's when most of the big focus is. So if we look at a Saturday at the right time of the year, at a decent course where there's some group racing, you tend to get pretty high liquidity. But of course, you may have to trade that overnight. You'd have to get up at 3 a.m. and trade until 7 in order to do that effectively. But I will do that. On some of the lower quality stuff, I tend to automate it nowadays, but certainly when we get some of the higher quality stuff, I will sit behind my desk and I will manually trade it as well, simply because it presents lots of opportunities. And if you're an early riser on a Saturday, you may catch the tail end of some of that group action, and you'll be able to see some of those higher liquidity markets as they actually unfold. So yeah, if you can get up a little bit earlier on a Saturday morning, you may be able to catch some of that decent group racing.